In the autumn of 1887 on the Dakota Plains, while homesteaders stacked firewood, Eric Dahl was doing something else. He was sharpening his roof's north edge into a ship's bow, his pregnant wife and son inside. Neighbors called it madness, but this former sailor believed it could split a blizzard in two. When the first storm struck, the question became, shelter or coffin? Eric Dahl had spent 10 years at sea, where a ship's bow could mean the difference between riding a wave and foundering. Now, 1,000 miles from saltwater, he'd built the same shape into his roof. The north edge was a sharpened blade of timber, not a wall. Neighbors called it suicide, but Eric believed a storm could be split like a wave. With winter closing in and his pregnant wife inside, the experiment was about to face its first gale. And a hard-bitten trapper named Gideon Holt was coming to tell him why it would fail. Gideon Holt reined his mule at the edge of Eric's claim, squinting at the cabin roof like a man reading trouble. He had survived 40 winters in the Dakota Territory, trapping beaver through black ice, digging out of drifts that buried entire wagons, and he had never seen a roof sharpened to a point. This one ran the whole north edge, a wedge of hand-hewn timber slicing outward like the prow of a ship. A thing meant to cut, not cover. The old trapper spat into the frozen grass and shook his head. "Boy," Gideon said, not loud, "you just built a blade pointed at the wind. The wind ain't known for bleeding." Eric didn't answer. He was on his knees sealing the gap where the angled planking met the cabin wall, his leather gloves worn thin. Inside the low-sod house, his wife Ellen was 5 months pregnant, and their 5-year-old son Sam played quietly beside the stove. They had no snow fence, no woodpile stacked high against the walls, no sensible defenses. Only that sharpened spine rising against the flat gray sky. Two other homesteaders had stopped by that morning. Olaf Knudsen, a Norwegian farmer who had lost half his cattle to the previous winter's drifts, studied the roof as if it might be a trap. He nudged his neighbor with an elbow. "He thinks the snow will just slide off like water," Olaf muttered. "That ain't how snow works. Snow packs. It clings. It'll pile against that angle and bury the whole house." A few weeks earlier, Eric had explained his theory at the trading post. He'd sketched it on a scrap of paper, a roof with no north-facing wall, only a steep ridge that met the wind head-on. On a ship, he'd said, when a wave strikes a flat hull, the force shudders through the whole vessel, but a sharp bow cleaves the water apart, dividing the pressure into two smaller streams that slide along the sides. He'd watched it 1,000 times off Cape Horn. Wind, he believed, was no different. A solid wall invited the storm to lean on it with everything it had. A sharpened edge forced the wind to split, exhausted, and passed harmlessly over and around. Nobody at the post understood. The trader, a balding man named Carlson, had laughed outright. "A roof ain't a boat, doll. You're going to kill your family on a sailor's daydream." But Eric remembered a night in the South Atlantic 4 years earlier. A rogue squall had hit his ship broadside. He was in the rigging, 50 feet up, clinging to frozen rope while the hull screamed beneath him. The captain had turned the bow into the worst of it, and the ship had cut through what might have rolled them. The next morning there was damage, but they were alive. The lesson stayed with him. You don't fight the sea or the wind head-on. You slice through it. That same year, he'd left the sea for good, married Ellen, and taken a homestead claim in the territory, where the winters were said to be as dangerous as any ocean. Now, facing his first prairie winter, he'd built his cabin to face the north wind like a ship riding out a gale. But the first test came sooner than expected. One night in late October, a hard freeze rolled south. The sky turned brittle white, and a cutting wind, not yet a blizzard, rushed down across the basin. Eric woke to the sound of something heavy scraping against the roof. Ellen held Sam close in the dark, her eyes wide. Eric pulled on his coat and unbarred the door, stepping into a swirling nightmare of ice pellets. For a moment he saw what he'd hoped. The powder was lifting up and over, not piling against the wall. But then the wind backed abruptly west. The shifted current caught the edge off angle, and snow began curling into a hard drift against the chimney. Within an hour, the chimney cap had ice building around it, threatening to block the flue. If the smoke couldn't escape, the cabin would fill with fumes. The same clever angle that was meant to split the wind had created a dangerous eddy. Eric climbed onto the roof in the dark. the wind screaming, hammer in hand. He worked for 4 hours, his fingers numb, nailing up a temporary wooden shield to break the eddy. Ellen watched from the window, wrapped in a blanket, her face pale. The cold was so bitter that frost formed on the inside of the glass. When he finally stumbled back inside, his lips cracked and bleeding, he knew the design was not enough. It had stopped the wind but nearly suffocated them. Over the next 3 weeks, Eric reshaped the roof. He didn't just repair the flaw, he rethought the entire system. He added angled splitters, planks jutting outward at precise intervals, creating multiple edges that would catch and resplit the wind regardless of direction shifts. He carved small channels into the wood to guide melting ice away from the chimney. And on the ground, he planted a double row of young cedar saplings, staggered like teeth, to break the ground-level draft before it could slam into the lower wall. His son, Sam, helped carry the saplings, his small hands blue with cold. The neighbors came again, this time in silence, watching the sailor turn his cabin into something that looked less like a home and more like a strange wooden fortress. Gideon Holt returned, too. He walked the perimeter slowly, studying the new angles, the curve of the roof line, the way the saplings would guide the wind upward. Then he looked at Eric, his expression unreadable. "I seen men try clever things," he said, "but the blizzard don't care about clever. It cares about cleaning the prairie of anything that can't survive." He paused. "You got a big storm coming. The sky's been quiet too long." The old trapper knew the signs. For 3 days after that, the wind simply stopped. The basin fell into a heavy, unnatural silence. The air turned iron gray and the temperature dropped so fast that the oil in the lantern froze. Ellen, now 6 months along, moved slowly, one hand always on her belly. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, the only sound in a world holding its breath. And Eric understood that the true test was not the first storm. It was the one now gathering beyond the ridge, a blizzard that would decide whether his family lived or died inside the sharp-edged roof he had built to split the wind. The blizzard did not arrive like ordinary weather. It arrived like a wall of white noise slamming sideways across the basin 3 hours after sundown. The first gust punched the cabin so hard that Sam cried out from beneath his wool blankets, and Ellen clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Outside, the world vanished. There was no horizon, no sky, just a spinning void that erased every landmark the homesteaders used to orient themselves. Eric stood by the north wall, ear pressed to the timber, listening. He wasn't listening for damage. He was listening for tone. On a ship, you could hear the difference between a cut wave and a striking one. He believed the roof would speak the same way. The wind screamed as it hit the sharpened spine, and then something strange happened. The scream splintered into two separate sounds, a high hiss sliding left, another sliding right. The roof shuddered, but it never buckled. For the next 3 hours, Eric remained at that wall, while Ellen fed the stove and kept Sam pressed against her side, and he did not move. By midnight, something else became apparent. The snow was not piling against the door. Normally, a north wind would bury the front of a cabin in a drift that climbed past the windows before dawn. But here, the powder was being flung outward, sculpted into long, curved drifts 20 feet from the walls. The sharp edge was doing exactly what Eric had promised, splitting the current, sending the snow on separate paths around the house. The area immediately surrounding the cabin stayed almost clear, as though the storm was actively avoiding it. But the roof had created a new problem Eric hadn't predicted. The wind splitting so cleanly generated a low-pressure pocket directly above the chimney. Instead of smoke rising straight, it was being sucked back downward, curling into the cabin in thin, acrid ribbons. By 2 in the morning, Ellen was coughing and Sam's eyes were watering. Eric had to act. He unbarred the door, tied a rope around his waist, and told Ellen to anchor the other end to the heavy iron stove. If he fell, the rope would hold him. He stepped into the white maelstrom, the cold striking his face like a blade, and climbed onto the roof. For 10 brutal minutes, he hammered a temporary wooden deflector into place above the chimney, changing the airflow just enough to let the smoke escape. When he stumbled back inside, frost had formed on his beard, and his fingers were too numb to work the door latch. Ellen had to help him, but the smoke cleared, and the fire pulled clean again. He had fixed one flaw, but the storm was still only beginning. At dawn, if you could call it dawn, the light outside shifted from black to a pale, directionless gray. The cold deepened. The cabin groaned as the temperature dropped further, and then the first real test of the roof's integrity arrived. Not wind, but ice. The sharp edge, supercooled by the wind, began to gather rime ice. Thin at first, then thicker, then building into a hard, glossy ridge along the entire spine. Each gust added another layer and the weight grew fast. Inside, Eric listened again. The sound had changed. The clean split was gone, replaced by a grinding, tearing noise, as though the roof was being slowly pulled apart. He knew what it was. Ice accumulation along the edge was shifting the load. The pressure that had been distributed across the entire roof was now concentrating on a single frozen wedge that threatened to peel the planking loose like bark from a tree. If it gave way, the whole roof could fail at once. Gideon Holt had been caught out hunting when the storm hit. He had spent the night huddled against his mule in a half-collapsed shelter of pine branches, waiting for a lull that never came. By morning, with his animal dead from the cold and his own strength failing, he followed the faint depression of a trail that memory told him led to the Dahl claim. He did not expect to find the cabin standing. He expected a burial mound. When he crested the low ridge on foot, bent double against the wind, he stopped and stared through frozen lashes. The cabin was not only standing, it looked wrong. Snow had carved a void around it, a calm pocket of clear ground, while the rest of the basin was buried in waist-deep drifts. The sharp roof line was visible even through the white-out black ice glinting along its edge like a polished keel. For a long moment, Gideon simply stood there, a man whose entire understanding of winter was being rewritten in real time. Then he stumbled forward, barely able to push through the deep snow, and fell against the door. Eric dragged him inside. The old trapper's lips were blue, his hands wooden, and he sank beside the stove without speaking for several minutes. Ellen wrapped him in a blanket and forced warm tea between his teeth. When Gideon finally looked up, his eyes went first to the roof beams, then to Eric. He said only 4 words, "You split the wind." But pride had no place in that cabin. The ice ridge was still growing, and Eric knew it. He explained the problem to Gideon, who listened with a grim expression. "If that ice don't come off," Gideon said slowly, "the whole north edge could peel back like a sardine lid." Eric had already reached for the rope. He was going back onto the roof. This time Ellen did not stay quiet. She grabbed his coat sleeve, her voice cracking. "If you fall, there's no one to catch you." She was right. The rope had held him once, but the ice had made the roof slope a sheet of glass. One slip and he would be hanging over the edge in a 60-mile-an-hour wind, unconscious within minutes. Sam, barely awake, clutched his mother's skirt, his small face a mask of confusion and fear. Eric looked at Ellen, then at the ceiling. The grinding noise was louder now. "If I don't go, the roof comes apart and we all die," he said quietly. He turned to Gideon. "Keep the fire hot. If I'm not back in 15 minutes, tie her to the stove. Don't let her come after me." Gideon nodded, his old eyes holding something that looked almost like respect. Eric climbed into the white fury. The wind slammed him flat against the roof the moment he reached the peak. The ice ridge was now a solid shelf, nearly 8 inches thick in places, and it hummed with a dangerous vibration. He pulled a short iron bar from his belt and began to chip at the ice, each strike swallowed by the roar of the storm. The work was slow, desperate. His hands went numb almost immediately. Below him, through the swirling snow, he could see the rope jerking with each gust, the only thing connecting him to the living. Inside, Ellen sat with Sam pulled tight against her, one hand still resting on the taut rope. Gideon fed logs to the stove and watched the ceiling with the practiced eye of a man who had seen roofs fail. Then, without warning, something shifted. A hard crack, not from outside but from deep within the roof beams. A plank had splintered. The ice was winning. On the roof, Eric felt the deck shudder beneath him. He chipped faster, the bar slipping in his numb grip. Then he heard it, a low, agonized groan that meant one of the splitters had torn loose. A section of the ice ridge broke free and tumbled away into the white void, and for one moment he thought the worst was over. Then a new sound, not from the storm but from below. A woman's cry, short and sharp, cut clean through the wind. Ellen's contractions, false for weeks, had suddenly become real. 6 months pregnant, alone on the frontier, and the baby was coming early. The cabin had no midwife, no doctor, no chance of help crossing the basin, and her husband was outside, balanced on a frozen roof in the middle of a record blizzard, his rope trembling with every gust. Gideon knelt beside her, his face pale. "I ain't a doctor," he said, his voice tight. "I delivered foals, not children." But Ellen's face was already slick with sweat, and the next contraction bent her forward with a gasp. Sam began to cry. The storm howled overhead, and on the roof, Eric heard his wife scream and understood that the gravest threat to his family was no longer the wind. It was time, and it was running out faster than the ice ever could. Eric heard Ellen's scream slice through the wind, and his whole body went cold. For one frozen second, he crouched on the roof with the iron bar still raised, staring at the ice ridge that was tearing his roof apart. Then the rope jerked tight around his waist, and he remembered he was still alive, still anchored. He shimmied down the slope, his boots skidding on the glaze, and dropped into the snow beside the door. The moment his feet hit ground, a second contraction bent Ellen double inside, her cry sharper this time. He burst through the door and saw Gideon kneeling beside her, the old trapper's face twisted with helplessness. Sam was sobbing in the corner. The cabin reeked of smoke and fear. The roof creaked above them, a deep, wounded sound, but Eric didn't look up. He skidded to his knees beside his wife and took her hand. "I'm here," he said, though his voice shook so badly the words barely held shape. She looked at him, eyes wild, and said, "Don't let me die in here." Gideon pulled him aside. "The baby's coming too fast," he whispered. "Nothing we can do to stop it. We got no medicines, no clean linens, nothing but hot water and a knife." Eric's mind raced. He had delivered a foal once, but never a child. He looked at the stove, at the single pot of water already steaming, and made a decision. He stripped off his frozen coat, scrubbed his hands in the hot water until they burned, and told Gideon to sit behind Ellen, to hold her up when the next pain hit. Then he asked his son, Sam, to stop crying and be brave. "I need you to hold the lantern close so I can see," Eric said. The boy's tiny face steadied. He grabbed the lantern with both hands and stood like a soldier. What happened next took 8 hours but felt like a lifetime compressed into a single straining breath. Ellen fought. She bit down on a leather strap Gideon had cut from his own belt. Each contraction came faster. The roof groaned every time the wind slammed the sharpened edge. The ice creaked and popped. Somewhere in the middle of it, a plank splintered, and sawdust sifted down through the rafters like a slow, silent warning. Eric didn't look up. He focused on the baby's head, on the words he remembered from an old ship's surgeon he'd once sailed with. The man had told him, "Birth is a storm, same as any other. You don't fight it. You ride it steady." So Eric talked Ellen through it like a helmsman guiding a ship through swells. "Breathe with the wave, not against it," he said, and she did. Gideon sat motionless, a mountain of a man who had seen wolves, starvation, white-out death, but never a woman fighting to bring life into the middle of a blizzard. At 4 in the morning, the baby slid into Eric's hands. A girl, tiny and furious, screaming into the cold air with a set of lungs that cut right through the wind. Ellen fell back against Gideon, weeping and laughing at the same time. Sam whispered, "Is that my sister?" And Eric, utterly spent, could only nod with tears freezing on his cheeks. They wrapped the infant in a cut-wool blanket and laid her against Ellen's chest. For a moment, the storm outside fell quiet, as if the blizzard itself had paused to listen. But the roof had not stopped creaking. The ice ridge had cracked further during the night, and now the north edge was hanging on by a splintered beam and the pressure of the wind itself. If the wind shifted before the ice melted, the whole sharpened spine might peel back like a page turning. Eric knew he couldn't go back out there yet. He was shaking too hard. So he sat beside his wife and daughter, listening to the weather, and made a calculation he hadn't dared make before. The roof, for all its flaws, had held through the worst of it. The design worked, but not perfectly. It needed adjustment, refinement. He had taught the wind to split, but the ice was a new enemy. He would need to design for that too. For now, the only thing keeping them alive was the very storm that wanted to kill them, pinned against the roof by its own force. At daylight, the blizzard weakened. The wind dropped from a scream to a steady moan. Snowfall thinned to stinging grains. By noon, the sky lifted enough that Eric could see the basin for the first time in 3 days. He stepped outside, shielding his eyes, and looked north. The sight stole his breath. A massive curved drift had built against the outer line of cedars, rising nearly to the eaves. It curved around the cabin like a horseshoe, a natural earthwork molded by the split wind. The sharpened roof edge was black with ice, but it was intact. The snow in the holding area was barely ankle deep. The chimney was clear. The goat shed had one corner buried, but the animals were alive. And beyond that drift wall, the rest of the basin looked flayed. Other homesteads were mounds of white, their roofs collapsed or completely hidden. Snow fences lay snapped like matchsticks. Gideon, who had spent the night warmed by the stove, walked out behind him and stood in long silence. Then he said, "You taught it where to break." It was not a question. Over the next week, as temperatures rose just enough for the hardpack to soften, the neighbors began emerging from their own dugouts and cabins. Some had lost livestock. Some had lost roofs. 2 families had lost breadwinners to the cold. When they saw Eric's cabin standing clean inside its ring of drifted snow, they came to stare. Olaf Knudsen rode over first, his face gaunt, his cattle decimated. He walked around the cabin, touching the sharpened edge, studying the cedar rows. "How?" he asked, and Eric began to explain, not with a speech but with his hands, showing the angle, the splitter planks, the way the wind moved like water. More people came. The trader Carlson, who had laughed at Eric in the store, came with a notebook, writing down measurements. The widow Hodge, whose husband had frozen trying to clear their chimney, came with her 2 boys and listened with hollow eyes. By early March, the thaw began in earnest. Eric's sharpened roof had become the talk of the basin, not as a curiosity but as a miracle. But Eric understood something the others didn't yet grasp. The design had worked for his cabin, but every roof was different. Every wind came from a different angle depending on the lay of the land. He had survived, but only just. The ice had nearly undone him. So when Olaf Knudsen asked if he could build the same thing for his farm, Eric hesitated. He was not a carpenter for hire. He was a sailor who had built one desperate idea for his own family. But then he remembered something from his years at sea, the code of the sailors. When a ship foundered, other ships came. When a man lost everything to the water, his brothers in sailcloth gave what they had, not for coin, but because the sea might take them next. He looked at his daughter sleeping in Ellen's arms, at Sam playing by the stove, and at the drift slowly melting outside. And he decided. He went to Olaf's farm. He studied the shape of the land, the way the north wind funneled through a gap in the low hills. He spent a day measuring, sketching, and then he began. He didn't ask for money. He told Olaf, "Pay me what you can. If you can't pay at all, pay the next man in need." The code was simple. Survival traded for survival. He built a sharpened prow on Olaf's roof, not a copy of his own but adapted to the land. Cedar posts, angled planks, drift lanes. Within a fortnight, 3 more families had come asking. He built for the widow Hodge, accepting only a side of bacon and a promise that she would send her boys to help another family in spring. He built for the Carlson trading post, securing a winter's worth of flour and lamp oil. By the time the prairie grass began to green, Eric Dahl had installed prows on 6 houses in the basin, each one shaped to the particular violence of the wind that threatened it. He never charged money. He only asked that each family donate whatever they could, and that they promise to help another if the need arose. It was a system that the frontier had forgotten, a maritime code planted 1,000 miles from any ocean. Gideon Holt, the old trapper who had once called Eric a fool, watched it all with a quiet, private understanding. One evening, as the sun set over the muddy basin, he found Eric outside his cabin, sharpening a cedar stake. "You know what you done?" Gideon asked. Eric didn't answer. "You didn't just build shelters," Gideon said. "You built a fleet." He gestured at the scattered homesteads, each now with its own wooden nose pointed into the north wind. Each one a ship. And that was the moment Eric fully understood the thing he had set in motion. He hadn't just saved his own family. He had taught the entire settlement how to ride out the storm. The great blizzard that had tested his roof was not a punishment. It was the proof that a sailor's instinct could reshape life on land. And the real test was no longer whether his design could survive one winter. It was whether the people he had taught could carry it forward into the next century, long after the old sailors were gone. The spring of 1888 came slowly to the Dakota Basin, dragging mud and memory in equal measure. The drifts that had buried wagons and barns shrank into dirty heaps, and the prairie revealed its dead. Livestock carcasses, collapsed roofs, the frozen bodies of two homesteaders who had tried to walk for help. But around the Dahl claim the thaw uncovered something else, the sharpened roof, black with melted ice, still standing. The cedar saplings, now stripped of leaves, stood in their staggered rings like a silent regiment. The cabin had become a landmark. Ellen named the baby Mara after her own mother, who had died on the crossing from Norway. The child was small but strong, with a cry that could fill the cabin. Gideon Holt lingered longer than he ever had at any homestead, helping with chores, chopping wood, watching Eric patch the splintered beam in the roof. The old trapper said nothing for days. Then one morning, while Eric was sharpening a new splitter plank, Gideon sat down beside him. "I seen plenty of men try to outfight winter," he said. "You're the first one I ever saw teach it something." He never called the roof a mistake again. Word of the survival spread beyond the basin. A traveling correspondent for the St. Paul Pioneer Press, a man named Whitfield, arrived in early April, picking his way through the mud with a notebook and a camera the size of a bread box. He interviewed Eric for 3 hours, sketching the roof angles, measuring the drift lanes, photographing the cabin with Ellen holding baby Mara in the doorway and Sam standing proudly beside the cedar rings. The article ran a month later under the headline, "The Sailor Who Tamed the Dakota Wind." It described Eric's design as a roof ship and noted, with some disbelief, that the cabin had survived the worst blizzard in 30 years while neighboring farms lay in ruins. The article ended with a sentence that would prove prophetic. Should the coming winters test this strange architecture again, the Dahl roof may become the standard for exposed homesteads across the territory. That autumn, the basin prepared for winter differently. 6 families now had Dahl-designed prows on their roofs, each tailored to the land's unique wind pattern. Olaf Knudson's farm sat in a shallow draw where the north wind funneled with extra force. Eric had built him a sharper angle, nearly 45 degrees, with 3 staggered splitters. The widow Hodges' sod house was low and wide. Eric had added a curved deflector that lifted the wind over the chimney before it could press against the walls. Carlson's trading post, which supplied the whole region, received a double row of pine saplings and a reinforced ridge that made the building look, as one customer joked, like a beached clipper ship. In all, before the first hard freeze, 8 roofs in the basin had been refitted with prows. Eric charged nothing for the work. Some paid in flour and salt pork, some in labor, some with nothing more than a handshake and the promise that they would help another family when the need arose. The sailor's code, transplanted from saltwater to prairie soil, was becoming the common law of the settlement. The winter of 1888 arrived with a fury that surpassed even the previous year. On January 12th, a cyclone of Arctic air swept down from Canada, pushing temperatures to 40 below zero and driving winds that snapped telegraph poles. The storm lasted 5 days. When it finally broke, the basin emerged to a landscape of hard white stillness. And every house with a Dahl prow was standing. The drifts had built exactly where Eric had predicted, not against the walls, but in curved berms 20 to 30 feet away. The families inside had burned less firewood, lost no livestock, and suffered no smoke blowback. Not one death was recorded among the households that had adopted the sharpened edge. The houses that had not were buried to their eaves, 2 collapsed entirely. The difference was so stark that by spring, 20 more homesteaders had requested the design. That year, Eric began teaching. He could not build prows for everyone, so he started training crews. Gideon Holt, now a de facto assistant, helped survey the land. Sam, 8 years old, carried stakes and measuring rope, learning to read the wind by the way it bent the grass. Ellen, with baby Mara strapped to her back, organized the payments. Barrels of oats, bolts of wool, a milking goat, a winter's worth of candles. The community had no money, but it had surplus and skill, and the code held. By 1890, more than 40 structures in the region featured some version of the split-wind roof. The local nickname, Doll's Fleet, became official usage in the county surveyor's records. In the summer of 1891, a young civil engineer from Chicago named Arthur Prentice traveled to the Dakota Territory on a commission from the territorial government. His assignment was to study wind damage to farm buildings and recommend construction standards. He arrived skeptical, having read the Pioneer Press article and dismissed it as frontier exaggeration. He spent 2 weeks in the basin, measuring roofs, interviewing families, and calculating wind loads. Then he stood on the ridge during a moderate gale and watched the Doll prows in action. Through a pair of field glasses, he saw the wind strike the sharpened edges and split, the snow streaming away in 2 clean trails. He wrote in his report, "The principle is not superstition, it is elementary fluid dynamics. A sharp leading edge reduces stagnation pressure and eliminates the formation of a high-pressure stagnation zone on the windward face." The Doll roof functions as a primitive but effective airfoil, converting a destructive normal force into 2 smaller lateral forces. This is the same physics that engineers are now applying to bridge trusses and ship hulls, applied intuitively. Prentice's report, published in 1892, recommended that the Doll roof be adopted as the standard for new homestead claims in exposed regions. It also contained a footnote that Eric never saw. The inventor has received no patent and seeks no royalties. His only condition is that the design be shared freely, a custom he attributes to the maritime traditions from which the idea originated. That same year, the railroad reached the basin, bringing a church, a school, and a doctor. Among the first arrivals was a young midwife named Cora, who had trained in Minneapolis. She examined Mara, now 4, and declared her healthy. Then she noticed Eric's roof and asked about the design. Before long, Cora had become an intermediary, helping Ellen coordinate the barter system while Eric taught new crews. The fleet grew. By the turn of the century, the sharpened roof had spread to 3 counties, and the phrase "building a doll" was part of the regional vocabulary. The final surprise came much later, long after Eric had died of pneumonia in 1907, surrounded by his family in the same cabin he had built. In 1934, during the height of the Dust Bowl, a professor of meteorology at the University of Kansas named Dr. Harold T. Barnes published a paper analyzing the aerodynamic windbreaks used by plains farmers to reduce soil erosion. He traced the modern methods to a series of field experiments conducted in the 1890s, which in turn cited the Doll roof as a foundational example. Buried in an appendix was a photograph of Eric's cabin, taken by Whitfield in 1888, with a caption, "Likely the first documented use of leading-edge flow separation in residential architecture." The paper went on to influence the design of windbreaks that saved millions of acres of farmland during the crisis. Mara Doll eventually married a carpenter named Eric Lindstrom in 1909. They lived in the same basin, in a house with a sharp northern edge. She kept a copy of her father's only interview, laminated with wax cloth, and taught her children to respect the wind, not fear it. The sailor's code of free exchange continued through 3 generations, a quiet legacy that never made headlines again but shaped the quiet survival of 100 families. And so, if you were to drive across that stretch of Dakota today, you'd still see a few old barns with an unusual geometry, a sharp spine pointing north, a ring of windbreak trees, a shape that makes you slow down and wonder. The descendants of the original fleet are still there, standing against the same winter winds. They have outlasted the railroad towns, the boom and bust, the dust. And in the hush after a blizzard, if you stand very still beside one, you can hear the wind split clean like water against a ship's bow, still teaching the storm where to break. The story of Eric Dahl is not a story of triumph over nature. It is a story of a man who stopped trying to win. He spent 10 years at sea learning that you do not fight a wave. You ride it. You study its shape, and you shape yourself to match. When he came to the prairie, he found a different ocean, one made of wind and snow and frozen silence. And he applied the same humility. He did not build a fortress. He built a hull. He taught a roof to act like a bow, and in doing so, he taught a community to think like sailors, to trade survival for survival, to see the storm not as an enemy but as a force that can be guided. The sharpened north edge still stands on a handful of old barns in that basin, their timbers weathered gray, their cedar windbreaks gnarled into living walls. Most of the people who live there now have no idea that a former mariner once carved a ship's prow into his roof and split a blizzard that erased other homesteads from the map. They just know that the old doll place never seemed to drift over, that the barn there has a funny shape, that the wind sounds different when it passes through. But the question that haunts this story is the same one that followed Eric into every winter of his life. Was his design truly brilliant, an act of frontier genius that outsmarted the plains? Or was Eric Dahl simply one of the few people willing to listen long enough to understand what the storm had been trying to teach all along? The blizzard did not become weaker. It did not become kinder. It remained the same indifferent violence it had always been. The difference was that one man finally stopped shouting at it and started paying attention. And in that quiet act of listening, he carved out a pocket of stillness where a baby girl was born during a whiteout, where a family survived record winds, where a code borrowed from the sea took root in the soil. The legacy of the doll roof is not really the angled timber or the cedar rings. It is the idea that the most dangerous thing on the frontier was never the cold or the snow. It was the certainty of men who refused to learn. If you want to witness more stories where ordinary people face the implacable and refuse to break, then subscribe now. Because somewhere out there, another storm is gathering, and another quiet mind is already measuring the wind.